Okay, so just to resume after that break, we've got four stages. Okay, we've got confrontation where we find out what the problem is. We've got opening where we talk about how maybe we can solve this problem and what we do actually agree on. For example, scientific methods and so on. What kind of evidence would be useful. Then we have the actual argumentation, and this is followed by the concluding stage. And the concluding stage is very important because in the concluding stage we have to agree about what the argument has actually shown. And if you think about real life arguments, it quite often happens that both parties walk away with very different understandings of what was agreed. Right? You have a meeting, you discuss something, and people walk out the meeting with completely different ideas about what was actually agreed at the meeting. So the concluding stage is very important, where you reiterate to the other person what exactly has been agreed upon, and make sure that they have the same understanding of that as you do, because if they don't, then the argument has all been for nothing, right? Okay, so we go through these stages. We try to get rid of this difference of opinion, um, and what exactly happens at those stages will obviously depend on the individual argument, right? There is an endless number of ways, an infinite number of ways in which the argument can progress. Okay. There are then questions whether viewing all argumentation in this way as a critical discussion, whether that's very helpful, right? So I've put down on this myself. For me, reasoning in my own head is something rather different, but it's still reasoning. I also believe that there are a number of forms of reasoning where there is no initial disagreement about standpoints, right? So it's perfectly possible, in my opinion, but the pragmadialecticians would look at this slightly differently. In my opinion, it's perfectly possible to say, look, there is a problem and we don't know the answer. So we look at arguments which might give us the answer, but nobody actually supports any particular standpoint and nobody actually opposes any particular standpoint. We simply examine arguments and we're still doing argumentation, in my view. Generally speaking, people who do prime dialectics believe that their model is flexible enough that it can be applied to all sorts of different things. I'm not completely convinced by that. One of the great advantages of chromodialectics, however, is that it results in a system of rules, and it therefore provides a very neat answer to the problem of what are fallacies. Fallacy theory is what we're going to talk about in the next class, but fallacies are things which go wrong with arguments. Now, the problem with fallacies is that they go wrong, arguments go wrong in many different ways, right? So different fallacies can be very different beasts. And previously, nobody had really come up with a good theory which sort of took into account all of the fallacies and put them into some sort of systematic order. But what pragmadialectics does, and does very well, is it says, well, a fallacy is breaking one of our rules. So you can come up with the names of fallacies, you can give examples, but everything is only fallacious if it breaks one of our rules, and everything which breaks one of our rules is a fallacy, whether you have a name for it or not, right? So they have a very neat system. They describe this as being a big breakthrough because they follow there's a very famous book by a guy called Charles Hamlin, in which he criticizes the way fallacies are normally construed, and as fallacies as being connected with basically with the logic of arguments. But many of the famous fallacies are actually not connected with the logic of arguments. They're connected with other things. So the pragmadialecticians tend to say, well, so their version is much better because it actually takes into account more parts of argumentation. There is a paper which I mention in the notes by a guy called Hans Hansen, that's his real name, which actually points out that Hamlin was basically wrong in suggesting that the earlier theoreticians of fallacy had actually believed in this particular way of looking at fallacies. As I said, we'll talk more about fallacies next time. But certainly pragmatic dialectics, by giving a list of rules and then saying, well, this is how arguments should be, so anything which breaks it is a fallacy, that's a breakthrough. That's very interesting. It was something which hadn't really been done before. It's also something which, in my more recent work, I've been building upon, and I think that my version is better, but that's something that hopefully we'll have time to talk a little bit about what I've been doing later on. We're supposed to have some classes on evaluation, so evaluation of arguments. But I've to some extent build on their way of looking at things. Okay, so if a fallacy is something which breaks the rules, well then the question is, what are the rules? In the book that I mentioned, the systematic theory of argumentation, they give 15 very complicated rules which are extremely difficult even for professional theorists to quite understand the way that they're written. So most people seem to ignore those 15 rules, and there was earlier a list of 10 rules which are actually written in normal language that can actually be understood. So these 10 rules are here in the notes. I'll just quickly go through them just to make sure that you understand them, because these are quite important, right? So rule number 1, parties must not prevent each other from advancing standpoints or casting doubt on standpoints. So this means basically that you can put forward any proposition, okay, and you can question any proposition. So there are no statements, no standpoints which are sacred and cannot be questioned. And there are no standpoints which are taboo and cannot be advanced, okay, in a serious critical discussion. The second one, a party that advances a standpoint is obliged to defend it if the other party asks him to do so. So this is about the burden of proof, okay? If you put forward a standpoint, you put forward an idea, it is your obligation to defend it if the other person does not accept it straight away. You cannot simply walk off and say, well, that's what I think and that's it. Of course, you can do that, but if you do that, you can't expect other people to take you seriously. Okay? So if you put forward the standpoint, if you advance it, it is your job to defend it if asked to do so. Okay? Number 3, a party's attack on a standpoint must relate to the standpoint that has indeed been advanced by the other party. This is a fairly obvious thing, that we can't have irrelevant arguments, and this rules out things like what we normally call ad hominem attacks. So your attack on a standpoint can't be an attack on the person who put the standpoint, it must be an attack on what they actually said. Okay, that should be fairly obvious. Number 4, a party may defend his standpoint only by advancing argumentation relating to that standpoint. Okay, so just as you can't attack a standpoint with something irrelevant, you can't defend it with something irrelevant either. Anything that you use in defense of your own position must be relevant, must relate to that position. You can't simply say something about yourself, right? You can't simply say something about your opponent or something about the general situation, which means that you should be believed. Okay, that doesn't work like that. Anything you put forward must be related to your standpoint. Number 5, a party may not falsely present something as a premise that's been left unexpressed by the other party or deny a premise that he himself has left implicit. Okay, so this is a little more complicated. At the beginning, when we have the opening stage, there are certain things we agree upon. Now, you may not falsely present something as having been agreed upon if the other party has not expressed agreement to that, right? You cannot say that the other person that you're arguing with accepts something when they haven't said that they accept it. Similarly, you cannot deny a premise that you have left implicit. So what do we mean by that? Well, leaving something implicit means we don't actually say it, but it is implied by what we said. So if our argument implies something, then we don't have the right to then turn around and say, well, actually it's not true, when we've already implied it, just because we haven't actually said it, right? So we are committed to support everything which is implied by our argument, not only what we've actually made explicit, what we've actually said. Rule number 6, a party may not falsely present a premise as an accepted starting point, nor deny a premise representing an accepted starting point. Okay, so you cannot lie about what was in the opening stage. You cannot say something was in the opening stage when it wasn't, and you can't say something wasn't in the opening stage when it was. Okay, so those starting points what very often happens, this may sound obvious, but what very often happens in real argumentation is that people kind of accept things at the beginning, and then as the argument goes along, they say, that they kind of say, well, no, actually that wasn't really true, or um, somebody else has not accepted something, but they kind of pretend that they did. They sort of just assume that, oh, just forget about that. Yeah, you said that, but really, it's important for me that you accept it, so we carry on. You can't do this. Okay, so again, these are fairly obvious things. The important point is that they are clearly stated here, so that when somebody does this, then we can say that it's a fallacy, it's not acceptable as an argument, it's unreasonable practice in argumentation because it breaks rule number 5, rule number 6. Okay, so it gives us a more systematic way of evaluating arguments. Okay, rule number 7, a party may not regard a standpoint as conclusively defended if the defense does not take place by means of an appropriate argumentation scheme that is correctly applied. When they talk about appropriate argumentation schemes, this is a little vague. So what they mean is you can't say that you have defended your standpoint if you have done so in any way other than by good argumentation, right? So what is good argumentation? Well, that's left a little bit vague here. But what this takes into account is that if you've given bad arguments, if you've given arguments based on false premises and so on, then you cannot later on assume that you have conclusively defended your standpoint, because your standpoint may well then be shown to be wrong because your argumentation was wrong. In point number 8, in his argumentation, the party may only use arguments that are logically valid or capable of being validated by making explicit one or more unexpressed premises. So, okay, you can only use good arguments. Again, it's saying something quite similar to the one before. If you use a logically invalid argument, then you have committed a fallacy. Or by making explicit one or more unexpressed premises. So what he means here is that the kind of premises which express that an argument is defeasible, that it is a presumptively true argument because it's not actually just purely logical, it's not deductive. Okay. Number 9, a failed defense of a standpoint must result in the party that put forward the standpoint retracting it. Right? So if you fail in your defense, if you cannot show that your standpoint is true, you must withdraw your standpoint. You can't say, okay, I can't prove it, but I'm going to keep to it anyway. It doesn't work like that. Okay? And a conclusive defense of the standpoint must result in the other party retracting his doubt. So if you can conclusively show that you are right, then the other person must accept that you were right. Okay? They can't continue to doubt you. And finally, a party must not use formulations that are insufficiently clear or confusingly ambiguous, and he must interpret the other party's formulations as carefully and accurately as possible. This is the only one which refers to the language of argumentation, which is another thing that I'm very interested in and I've done a lot of work on. Formulations must be clear. So, of course, sometimes it's possible to win an argument by simply using vague language or ambiguous language. If this is what one does, one cannot assume that one has won the argument. Okay, so I think that most of those rules should be fairly straightforward. That's the whole point of this approach, is to give us these rules. And as I said, this is one way of describing what fallacies are. Okay, so I think that that's going to be enough for today. Next time we will talk about part 4, about fallacies. I will discuss generally what fallacies are and fallacy theory in general, and we'll look at the list of fallacies which is at the end of that section of well-known fallacies, and make sure that you know what they are. And then after we've done that, then I'll provide you with a text which contains some fallacies, and I will ask you to analyze it. Okay, and possibly I'll just put this in as the last thing. What I'd like to do maybe is that once you've had a look at that text and you've had a bit of a chance to analyze it, maybe we will be able to have a meeting where all of us will take part, and we'll be able to discuss that text and generally discuss how we find fallacies in writing. The obvious way to do that, well, as I understand it, would be to use the Teams application. The other group that I have that I've tried to use Teams with have all told me that they don't know how to do it. But well, they're master students, so maybe they're too old for such things. I don't know. Being younger, maybe you'll be better at that. Maybe you've used it with some other classes. I don't know, but we need to be in touch about that. Um, but that will be in a couple of weeks, I guess, anyway, because I need to do one more of these videos, and then I'm going to give you another task. But if anybody can let me know if you've been using Teams with other teachers, let me know, or if you've had problems, let me know, and then we'll try to find some other solution. Okay. All right. So for now, I think we'll finish there. If you have any questions, any problems about what I've talked about today, please let me know. Oh, I just remember one other thing. I thought it might be kind of fun. Once we've gone through these 4 sections, I might just give you just a little online test. Very simple little test just to see whether you've actually read and understood these notes. So it will just be some simple questions on these notes. It'll be online, so of course, you can look at your notes while you do it if you wish. But it will also just be some kind of evidence of interaction between us, and it'll just illustrate to me whether people have actually understood, right? So maybe we'll make it so that the score counts just a tiny bit towards your final mark, a plus or a minus here or there. So it'll be worth trying to get a good score. But the main thing that I'll be interested in really will be to see whether you actually do follow what's in the notes, what I'm talking about. Is very difficult for me when I can't see you and I can't see the look in your eyes, tell whether you understand or not. Some of these concepts are, for me, that is what I work with every day. It seems very obvious. For you they might be quite strange because it's not the typical stuff that you deal with when you're just learning a language. So it will be interesting to see, but that will be just a little bit of fun. It'll be on the website, and I'll probably put that together, and well, again in a couple of weeks, because you need to go through the 4th part first. Anyway, okay, all right, that's enough from me. So I'll say goodbye for now. Goodbye.